Welcome to Jesus Changes Everything, a daily podcast dedicated to providing a fresh look at the ancient and glorious truth that Jesus not only reigns, but is busy about the business of bringing all things under subjection, that celebrates the wonder and the glory that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth. It's Tuesday, and that means it's time for another one of our isms, and out of my devious plotting, I have decided today to cover Machiavellianism. Machiavellianism. Let me, in a Machiavellian way, spell that for you. It's Machiavellianism. And Machiavellianism is that political doctrine of Machiavelli, who was an Italian leader in the time of the Renaissance, who argued that any means, however unscrupulous those means might be, can be used by a ruler in order to create and maintain his autocratic government. In a sense, one could argue that Machiavellianism is the application of the principle that the ends justify the means to politics. Now, this ism is named after Machiavelli because he promoted this idea in his famous work called The Prince. And The Prince is one of those works that has made its way into the Western canon, not necessarily because the people who put the canon together think that it's a honorable work, but rather because they recognize that it is a important and influential work. So Machiavelli writes The Prince, giving his counsel to those who either aspire to political power or who already have political power and are seeking wisdom on how to grow and or maintain that power. So a person who is described as Machiavellian is someone who will stop at nothing in order to get or gain this power. I think a great example of that would be the late Charles Colson, not in terms of seeking his own power, but in terms of supporting the power of Richard Nixon. Charles Colson was reported to have said something along the lines of, I would run over my own grandmother to make sure President Nixon gets reelected in 1972. He was called Nixon's hatchet man. He was the one who did, or at least set up, the dirty doings that, again, helped to keep Nixon in power. That's an example of that. The Steele dossier that was used by Hillary Clinton's campaign against Donald Trump is another example of Machiavellian politics. It's unscrupulous, dishonest, frankly, wicked behavior for the hope of political gain. Now, one doesn't have to be involved in politics proper in order to be guilty of Machiavellianism. I've heard it said, actually it was my father who said, that he's never known a single group of people more petty and small than academic people. That at institutions of higher learning there is a lot of politics. It's true really of any kind of business. that someone, a boss who takes credit for an idea of a subordinate in order to shore up his position relative to his boss is behaving in a Machiavellian manner. The person who sabotages their coworker is behaving in a Machiavellian manner. Those are the kinds of things that can even happen in a family. The thing that's strange about Machiavellianism is that Machiavelli actually defends this kind of behavior. He's not simply giving a descriptive of this is what people are prone to do, but he actually gives a defense and says, this is what you ought to do. It's sort of the political equivalent of Gordon Gekko from Wall Street saying greed is good. Okay? So it's kind of giving free rein to one's own lust for power and not being conscious of the call to justice. Now, the trouble is, here's what happens so often. The temptation, and this is where we come back to the means, ends justifies the means. The temptation is to think, well, because I'm the good guy and they're the bad guy, I have to use their tactics in order to get in power or stay in power so that you have a good guy in power instead of a bad guy in power. That's the temptation of the devil. Because when we reduce ourselves to those Machiavellian means, we instantly become a bad guy. So do not succumb to this temptation in your own life or even in the things that you support. We say it all the time. Wouldn't it be great if we had candidates for public office who were men of integrity? And yet we're all calculating and trying to figure out. But I remember, I won't go there today. I'm sure it'll come up again in the future. But stop the plotting and let's just do right. One of the great evils of decline in the broader culture is the effect it could have in the Christian culture. As the broader culture becomes more and more morally slipshod, immorality is defined downward. Christians tend to be comfortable if we can manage to stay ahead of the world's curve. Sadly, when it comes to marital fidelity, it seems we're not even doing that. Evangelical Christians, or so the scuttlebutt goes, are virtually just as likely as their unbelieving counterparts to commit adultery. Our infidelity, in one sense, is much worse than the infidelity of the infidel. In both cases, of course, families are torn asunder. In both cases, the lives of children are turned upside down. But in the case of the professing Christian, we add to that we are lying to the watching world about who Jesus is and who the church is called to be. That is, when a man is unfaithful to his wife, he says that Jesus is unfaithful to the church. When a wife is unfaithful to her husband, she says that the church is free to be unfaithful to Christ. This follows from Paul's connection of the husband and wife and Jesus and the church in Ephesians 5. These lies are no small things. It is, after all, one thing to lie about how big the fish that got away was, but it is entirely another thing to lie about Jesus and his bride. We ought to be modeling for the world what fidelity looks like. We, of all people, ought to understand this call. Jesus, after all, was faithful even to death on the cross. We fail here in the end because we're worldly. While the world walks into marriage seeing it as something temporary, and we walk into it thinking it designed for permanence, what we have in common is how we view the purpose of marriage. We both, believers and unbelievers alike, walk down the aisle believing that marriage exists for the sake of our own happiness. When our marriages no longer provide the level of happiness we believe is our due, our eyes, our hearts, and our bodies begin to wander. We begin to look for excuses to escape our marriages. We walk into adultery, step by step. We will not improve here corporately until we recognize and repent for this scandal. God will not forgive us until we show forth a broken and contrite spirit. The solution is not more marriage retreats. The solution isn't more careful premarital counseling. The solution is not a repeal of no-fault divorce laws. Now, these all may be good things, but we will change only when we see that we are one flesh with our spouses, that infidelity is a failure to be faithful to ourselves, that hurting our spouse only hurts us. We will change only when we remember that God gave us our spouses as a gift, not a burden. We will change only when we recognize that physical adultery isn't a new sin, but is merely the end of the road we began traveling when we look at another with lust, whether that other is a pin-up girl, or the hero in a romance novel, or that nice person at work. May God have mercy on our marriages. You've been listening to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a production of Dunamis Fellowship, the teaching outreach of Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe, which you can do at all the usual outlets, to tell your friends, and to spread the word. To learn more about the work of Dunamis Fellowship, please visit rcsproulJR.com. And join us next time on Jesus Changes Everything.